Paul was on house arrest, alone. Yet, still, he wrote a letter with words of transformation, joy, purpose, and good news. If Paul did it, so can we. Let's find joy. Let's find purpose. There is truly good news. It's time. Let's press on.
Well, hey, Brookside, it is so good to be worshiping our Lord together today, however you're checking in, whether you're checking in online or from one of the mods at our Correctional Center campus. It is so good to have you as part of our church family, whether you're watching from Elkhorn or from Millard. So good to see you and to be together today. My name is Tim, and I'm one of the pastors here at Brookside. Well, I've been loving this series we've been going through as we've been walking section by section through the book of Philippians over the last handful of weeks or so. And now that we've turned the corner and we're kind of past the halfway point of the series where we're just tracking through this book that Paul wrote in the first century to the church in the city of Philippi that God is still speaking through today, as we turn the corner, I want to be sure and do some quick review to look back and just appreciate the ground we've covered so far. But also, if you're checking in for the first time today, that way you can catch up and move forward with us as we take some new ground here in just a minute. So in chapter 1, we dug in and we saw that Paul brings up some very important topics that are very relevant to each of us. Topics like prayer. What does it mean to talk with God? Topics like perseverance and eternal perspective and purpose. I know from chapter 1, the thing that grabbed me so clearly, so strongly from that chapter was just how laser-focused Paul was on the gospel. That the gospel, what Jesus is doing in and for the world, it was the lens through which Paul saw everything, all of life, the good times, but also the struggles and the trials. And then we turned the corner and we went into chapter 2, and we saw Paul bring up this idea, this virtue of humility. And there's no way for me to overstate how important humility is for our lives. And so Paul said, if we want to grow in humility, the solution isn't to try really hard to grow in humility. Instead, the solution is to look long and hard to fix our attention on Jesus Christ, on who he is, and on what he's done for us in the cross. And then in that way, Jesus serves as our example. But really, the more we get to know Jesus, we realize that he's not just our example, that the life that he came to offer us through dying for us on the cross, through taking our place there, it actually works inside out from us. It changes our hearts so that way we actually want to be others-centered. We want to grow in humility. And then last week, Jeff took us into verses 12 through 18 of chapter 2, where we saw Paul call us to a bigger vision of life than one characterized by complaining or grumbling or arguing. These traps that are just so easy to fall into. But instead of those, Paul tells us, hey, let's replace those with virtues like humility or like faith in a big God, like gratitude. And let's leave behind grumbling and arguing. And as we do that, followers of Jesus will stand out and shine bright in a culture that needs to see followers of Jesus living distinctly in that way. And now that brings us to today, to the passage we're talking about now, Philippians chapter 2, verses 19 through 30. And to be honest, when I saw that I was up for this passage, I took one of those like deep gulps, like grabbed my collar a little bit. It's like, okay, this is what pastors think about. How am I going to get a full message out of that passage? Right? Because at first glance, it reads like a travel itinerary. Lots of who's going where and when they're going there. It doesn't seem super compelling when you first read through it. It's an easy passage, it seems, to skip past or to skim through. It's easy to do that until we take the time to listen to Paul. Until we take the time to really dig into it and see what's all there, because there is treasure in this passage that we do not want to skip past or skim over. In fact, I would even say that this passage is as timely for where we're at right now in our culture. It's as timely for us as any other passage is in Philippians. And here's why. This passage, Philippians 2, verses 19 to 30, it is all about the value of relationships and the difference that healthy relationships make in our lives. And we've all been brought to mind. We've all been reminded how important healthy relationships are these last 7 months, haven't we? I mean, maybe we've been reminded of this through the absence of certain relationships that used to be close to us but have now become distant. Maybe we've been reminded of the value of relationships because of the work we've had to exert to continue to sustain healthy friendships ourselves. Psychologists, they're actually calling this loneliness that's so rampant in our culture, psychologists are calling it a silent pandemic. And COVID has only heightened our awareness of how serious and how severe isolation can be. Relationships matter. Maybe you've heard the phrase, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. Or Charlie Tremendous Jones, he's got a quote that says, you'll be the same person in 5 years as you are today, except for the books you read and the people you meet. Relationships matter. When you're asking questions like who do you want to be in 10 years? What can you do now to start moving that direction? Will you be glad you did 10 years from now? Who are you becoming? At least part of the answer to questions like these as we think about them ourselves, at least part of the answer, it'll deal in some way with relationships because relationships matter. All of these things are saying that in different ways. Relationships matter. That's the truth that arises so clearly out of this passage in Philippians 2. And so I want to imprint that in our minds and in our hearts. So here's where you can talk in church, write it in the chats, whatever you want to do. But say it after me, right? Engage with me here for a second. Relationships matter. Say it with me. Relationships matter, right? That's the point that we want to see from Philippians 2. As we press on in the gospel, in all of the ways Paul wants us to press on in the gospel, in prayer and perseverance, and eternal perspective and in humility, as we press on in all of these ways, Brookside, we press on together doing that. We need others around us to keep us pointed in the right direction. Or here's how I think Paul would say it. We need relationships around us that are centered on the gospel. This is why the church is so important, because the church is primarily a people. The church is primarily a people who gather to focus on relationships, to focus on the things that matter most for relationships. This is why gathering is so important. I know my family, my boys and Carrie and I, we have felt the concrete benefits of gathering in all sorts of very, very tangible ways over the last 6 or 7 months. The value of relationships is all over Philippians 2, verses 19 to 30. Keep your eyes out for that value. See where you can pick it out as I read through the passage. Here's what Paul says, verse 19. It says, I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, that I also may be cheered when I receive news about you. I have no one else like him who will show genuine concern for your welfare. For everyone looks out for their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know that Timothy has proved himself, because as a son with his father, he has served with me in the work of the gospel. I hope, therefore, to send him as soon as I see how things go with me, and I'm confident in the Lord that I myself will come soon. But I think it is necessary to send back to you Epaphroditus, my brother, co-worker, fellow soldier, who is also your messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs. For he longs for all of you and is distressed because you heard he was ill. Indeed, he was ill and almost died. But God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but also on me, to spare me sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore, I am all the more eager to send him, so that when you see him again, you may be glad, and I may have less anxiety. So then welcome him in the Lord with great joy and honor people like him, because he almost died for the work of Christ. He risked his life to make up for the help you yourselves could not give me. Here's the quick flyover of what's going on in that passage historically. Paul is in prison as he's writing this. And in the first century, there's no guarantee when you're in prison that some of your basic needs, things like food and clothing, would have been provided for. And so you would need others around you to help provide for your care and some of these just, I need to live sort of needs that we have. One of Paul's closest friends and proteges, Timothy, is already with him while he's writing this. Timothy has been working closely with Paul for about 10 years at this point. So they're tight, they're very close. They've been co-workers about the things that matter most for a long time. And then this church that Paul planted in Philippi, they hear that he's sick. And so they send Epaphroditus up to go see Paul, where Paul is probably in prison in Rome. And that trek from Philippi to Rome is more than 700 miles. So it is no small thing for Epaphroditus to do this. He comes with a financial gift for Paul, and he was intending to stay and provide ongoing support and presence alongside of him. But Epaphroditus, he gets deathbed sick, probably on this arduous journey from Philippi to Rome, because you could contract a lot of things on that sort of journey. He recovers, and Paul sends him back to Philippi earlier than anyone first intended. And Epaphroditus is probably the one actually bringing the hard copy letter that Paul first wrote to Philippi. Epaphroditus is bringing it with him on his return trip. So that's the history, that's the backdrop. But there's so much more to this passage than just that itinerary information. Here's what jumps out so clearly once we press into it just a little bit. We see that relationships matter deeply. The Apostle Paul, he wasn't some Lone Ranger, every man is an island sort of Christian, it's a sort of leader. The Apostle Paul knew that relationships mattered for him. And the Apostle Paul, he knows that relationships matter for us, that they matter in helping shape us into the people we're becoming, and relationships that advance the gospel in exponential ways. That's why Philippians 2, verses 19 to 30 is so valuable. That's why we need to listen in to what it tells us today. And so straight out of this passage, let me just very quickly point out 3 attention-getting reasons why gospel-centered relationships make a difference in your life. These relationships, they provide a compelling picture of Christianity. They help foster deep connection with others about the things that matter most. And then these gospel-centered relationships, they establish gospel partnerships where the gospel can multiply in exponential ways all around the globe. Let's see how these take shape in Philippians 2. First, gospel-centered relationships, they provide this compelling picture of Christianity. For a few years, one of my boys was big into puzzles. And so I remember one time he was going to spend some of his birthday money, $10 or $15, on this puzzle that he really wanted to get. And so we're in the aisle at Target looking at this whole row, this whole aisle of a whole lot of puzzles to choose from. And he chooses one of the puzzles that has way too many pieces, more pieces than we'd ever tried to put together before. And it was a cityscape, so it was hard. Lots of similar colors, lots of lights. And so me, being the great dad that I am, I'm like trying to lure him back to the Lego aisle, away from this puzzle, like, hey, let's at least build something that has instructions with it. He was not to be convinced. And so we got this puzzle, and we do what you always do when you get a puzzle. You take it home, put it on the card table, dump out all these pieces. It was overwhelming for us. And so we do what everybody does. You stand the box top up in front of you, right? Because you need a picture of what it is you're building toward. To fast forward to the end, that puzzle beat us, by the way. Like puzzle 1, Weebies 0. We never finished it. I think our dog ate a couple of the pieces, or they mysteriously disappeared some other way. But we need a picture of what it is we're looking at. That's why we needed that puzzle box top in front of us. And I would say that formation in anything, formation in any skill or any virtue works exactly the same way. We need a picture of what we're working towards. We need a model. We need an example for that. I mean, if you're new to a job, you probably shadow a longer-term employee for a long time before you're entrusted with significant responsibility. When my oldest transitioned to high school, his freshman year, he was in an orientation-type class with 2 upperclassmen, 2 seniors, who could just provide examples and modeling for these freshmen about how to transition well to high school. Parents, you know that you are models for your kids. They are always watching everything you do, for good or for not so good. And here's why this modeling, here's why it makes such a difference, is because we need a picture of what it is we're working towards. And in Philippians 2, in the larger context that our passage is set in Philippians 2, we know it's very clear what Paul is trying to cultivate and call out in us. He's trying to call out humility in us. That's where the chapter starts, verses 3 and 4. Paul says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility." Again, that's what he's driving us towards. In humility, value others above yourselves. not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. And then like we saw a couple weeks back, Blaze did such a good job with this. Paul gives the premier example of how we grow in this others-centered, self-sacrificing humility. Paul points us to Jesus, the perfect example of the humility we need to cultivate. But I wonder if there are readers of Paul's letter in Philippi that have the same sort of reaction that maybe we have when we hear Paul pointing us towards Jesus as the example. I mean, we think, well, of course Jesus can do that. He's God. Or maybe you say, I mean, it's a great example, but man, that's Jesus. And we use that as an excuse to say, okay, maybe I'll take 1 or 2 steps in the direction of humility, but I'm not going to take all 10. I'm not going to value it that much because that example of Jesus Christ just seems too daunting for some of us. And that's why I think Paul, he anticipates that excuse. And so he puts 2 people that are just like you and just like me. He doesn't just point us to Jesus. He says, hey, look at Timothy. Hey, look at Epaphroditus. They are models too of this same sort of humility we all need to be growing in. Look at what Paul says about Timothy in verses 20 and 21. He says, I have no one else like him who will show genuine concern for your welfare, Philippi. Timothy isn't thinking about his own interests. He's thinking about theirs. Verse 21, for everyone else looks out for their interests, not those of Jesus Christ. The implication is, but that's not Timothy. Timothy is a model of the humility Paul is pointing us toward. Or Epaphroditus, he serves Paul even at the greatest cost to himself. He gets very sick. Verse 30 says he risked his life for the sake of Jesus. Humility is the virtue that is underneath that sort of service and sacrifice. We need a picture of what we're working toward. We need the box top in front of us, and healthy relationships provide that. I'm so grateful for the ways that there are good modeling, compelling pictures of Christianity, those type of relationships in my own life. I'm so grateful for the steadfast example of my parents. Some of my earliest memories growing up are walking into the kitchen as just a little boy, and my parents were there with a bowl of cereal in front of them. It was early in the morning, bowl of cereal, and their Bibles spread out in front of them. And that was just imprinted on my mind and in my heart from an early age that, hey, my parents, they are orienting their day from the start of their day around a relationship with Jesus. I'm so grateful for that picture, that compelling picture, that good picture of Christianity. Or when I was in high school, my youth pastor, John, he invested so much time into me that I'm so grateful for that. I didn't deserve to be poured into. There wasn't a whole lot of me that drew John to me. But instead, he saw one little thing, and he poured fuel on a small fire of what God was doing in my heart. He did that in high school, college, and well beyond that. I'm so grateful for John's influence in my life, and I still need this sort of modeling. A couple men's groups that I'm in, they've got guys who are older than me that I love that I can ask these men, hey, how do you do parenting when this particular issue comes up? Or I can ask these guys about how they can follow Jesus well over a long period of time. We need that sort of modeling ourselves, and then we need to be that sort of model for others, where we're helping others incrementally see this picture of Christ-likeness, that we can provide that compelling picture for them. Doesn't mean you're perfect, right? None of us are perfect. But here's what it does mean. It just means you're available for that. So who can you show care and intentionality to? Probably in some ways that feel very informal. But who can you show care and intentionality to help them grow in their knowledge and application of the gospel? Just a couple nights ago on Friday, our middle school ministry hosted an event called The Bash, where all the different small groups went out to homes around the city. And we had, I think, 13 sixth grade boys in our basement for 5 hours on Friday night. So if you saw like this mushroom cloud rise up from West Central Omaha, that might have been my house. No, it was great. The house is still standing. They actually left it really clean. It was fun. Our boys loved it. Our twin sixth graders had such a great time. But you know what I'm most grateful for? For Keaton and for Luke. These two upper teen, 20-something models that as these sixth grade boys continue growing into men, that they've got a compelling picture in Keaton and in Luke, and then in all of our tribe leaders, all of our volunteer leaders that did that, to say, okay, that's why it's worth following Jesus through my teen years, into my 20s, and beyond. We need that sort of compelling picture. Relationships give us that compelling picture, and healthy relationships also give us deep connection with others about the things that matter most. All the way back in the 12th century, a guy, Christian leader actually by the name of Aelred, he wrote about 3 different kinds of friendship, and what he says is still so applicable today. Here are his categories of friendship that a lot of people now have talked about and riffed on in different ways. His labels are carnal friendship, worldly friendship, and spiritual friendship. Again, these are his labels, but here's what he's getting at. Carnal friendship is friendship that is concerned about common interests and affinity. It goes no deeper than that. If interests change, the friendship changes or the friendship ends. Worldly friendship is based on usefulness. You are getting something from the other person, or they're getting something from you, whether that's pleasure, whether that's climbing a career ladder, or whatever else it could be. It's all about transaction in worldly friendships. But spiritual friendships are based on the things that matter most. It has the interest of the other person in mind, and it deals with soul-level issues. It centers around things that are of eternal value, and it centers on Jesus Christ. Now, my own riff on that is that there's a place for all of those sorts of friendships and relationships in our lives. But too often, I think we settle for only the first two, common interests and usefulness. And we never get to those friendships that are spiritual friendships, dealing with soul-level issues, the things that matter most. But in the face of that, Paul shows us a better way right here in this passage. If you're going to study Paul's relationship with Timothy in the New Testament, you would see that this relationship is very close, very personal, and very important to both of them. Right there in verse 22, Paul describes his relationship with Timothy as a son, as a father to his son. That's how close that relationship is. Verse 20, Paul says of Timothy, I have no one like him. That translates this Greek word that literally means we are of one mind or we are of one soul. And the only way you can cultivate that sort of same soul relationship is by getting way beneath the surface and getting to the things that matter most. Look what Paul says about Epaphroditus in verse 25. He describes him like a brother and a fellow soldier. Watch the miniseries Band of Brothers, and you will know that being a fellow soldier with somebody forges deep relationships with others about things that matter deeply. Or when Epaphroditus is so sick, Paul feels deep sorrow at the prospect of losing him. Everything in this passage points us toward the deep connection that Paul cultivates with these two men, with Timothy and Epaphroditus. And so now the question is for you, for us. Take stock of the relationships in your own life. Where would you put your relationships on those 3 different levels of common interests, usefulness, or spiritual friendships? Are they characterized by deep connection? If you've got a small handful of those sort of friends, that's great. Your job this week is to write those friends a note or send them a text or give them a call and say, thank you so much for helping us forge a relationship about things that matter very deeply, about things that matter at the soul level of our lives. Or maybe you've got a ton of relationships, but none of them get to that level of spiritual friendship. What steps can you start taking this week to move the needle in that direction? Where you just ask yourself, how can I start to show some personal transparency? What are some questions I can ask about things that really matter? How can I show care about their relationship with Jesus and their eternal destiny? Or if these sorts of relationships are non-existent, if you just don't have many friendships around you at all, what can you do? What can you do now, even given all the factors that are swirling around us in our culture, to put yourself in the pathway of relationships? I know it takes courage. I know it takes time and patience, but it is so worthwhile. Paul had every excuse in the book to back off of relationships. He'd been burned by hostile relationships. He is now isolated as he's writing this, and cultivating any sort of relationship takes a ton of effort and work. But Paul doesn't back off. He presses in. And the reason he does that is because he knows how vitally important relationships are. Relationships matter. They give us a compelling picture of Christianity. They develop deep connection. And then third, gospel-centered relationships. They establish gospel partnerships. When Paul is writing this letter to the church in Philippi, he's stuck. He's in prison. He can't get out, and he doesn't know how his story is going to end at this point. But gospel ministry continues through Timothy and Epaphroditus. And the reason is obvious. It's because the spread of the gospel doesn't depend solely on the Apostle Paul. The spread of the gospel never depended solely on the Apostle Paul. Keep reading the New Testament, and you will see Paul is always surrounded by co-workers and teammates who are active with him at spreading the gospel message. What's cool is that Paul he includes the whole Philippian church in these partners of the gospel. Chapter 1, verse 5, Paul calls all of them partners in the gospel with him. Paul depended on gospel partnership for gospel multiplication. That's how the gospel spread as it did in the first century, and that's how the gospel continues to spread today. Not through one person, not through paid staff, through you, through me, through us as a church, all of us seeing ourselves not as spectators, not as consumers, but as gospel partners who are contributing actively to the advance of the gospel around us. That's the vision we want to continue to stir at Brookside, where every one of us is asking, how can I look at the spheres of influence that I have? My extended family, my friendships, my campus, my school, my workplace, my neighborhood. And how can I be a gospel presence in that space? Well, now in a second, Mark is going to come out, and he's going to talk specifically about our partnerships overseas, sharing how the work of the gospel is advancing in places like Zambia and the Dominican Republic. And I'm so excited to get this in front of us, Brookside, to certainly stir our own inspiration and excitement for what God is doing all around the world, because God is working all around the world. Jesus is still building his church all around the globe. So I want this to stir our excitement. I want this to give us some specific ways to join our partners in prayer, praying specifically for them as they labor faithfully overseas. But then I also want this to be one more compelling picture for all of us as we see their examples of gospel faithfulness in Zambia, in the DR. How can that cause us to look in ourselves and say, how can I be that same sort of gospel partner in the place God has put me in my city, with my family, and at my job? Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Yeah, today I wanted to share with you a little bit about two main areas we focus in the world in terms of our global impact ministry, and that is Zambia and the Dominican Republic. And really, the stories I'll share with you today remind me a lot of when we looked at the first chapter of Philippians a few weeks ago and talked about he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion. We've seen some really neat things happen in the last several years in our work in Zambia and the DR, and I want to share that with you now. About 12 years ago, we started our work in Zambia. We became aware of a guy named Navas Kalunga, Pastor Navas, who was not only working in his little church, but training other pastors and launching other churches all around his region of rural Zambia. And there was a problem he was coming up against, which was he couldn't reach all the kids that had these kids, hundreds of them really, that had been orphaned by the AIDS crisis in their area. And so he said, what can you do to come alongside these kids? He had this vision for a place where they could be fed and educated, and that's become the Hope Center that we now support there. We saw God kind of do a little miracle among us as we learned of that vision for the Hope Center. We had a chance to take a special offering as a church. We said, hey, we need $25,000 to build a building where this can all happen on this new land that they had laid out there. And we saw God provide 5 times that amount in that special offering, really launched that whole ministry forward to that partnership in Zambia that goes on to this day. Currently, there are about 64 kids that are helped in the Hope Center program, and they come in and they get educational help. There's books and a computer lab there and tutors and things, and then they also have a good solid meal each day, which is really critical for them coming from the homes of poverty that they're in, and so they get the food, the education, they get spiritual formation help there as well at the Hope Center. God's doing a lot of neat things there. Of the 64 kids, this fall we get to celebrate 12 of them are actually going to get a high school diploma, a high school graduation. And that may not seem like a huge deal, but in the area that they live in, even to finish primary school is not real common. And so for them to not only finish primary, but now secondary school, get their high school degree, changes the trajectory of their lives. They will have many, many opportunities because of that. And so we really celebrate their hard work and our ability to support them through that school program. One of them in particular, not these 12 that graduated, but one alumni from the Hope Center had another milestone this summer too. Her name's Deborah. And Deborah came to the Hope Center as a young girl. She wrote this at the time, right, as she was coming. She was wanting to get an education, but she said, I was praying to God, asking him, where can I get the money to pay for school? I have found no money, nowhere. But now God has shown me the Hope Center, and they have started paying for me. Because of this, my family and I praise the Lord. Deborah knew she needed to have a uniform and books to be able to attend school, and she didn't have that. But the Hope Center, as she was referred to the Hope Center, we were able to get her plugged in. Not only did she finish her schooling up through high school, we were able to start kind of a new little program and support her through college. And this summer, she graduated with a teaching certificate, and she'll begin a job as a teacher and impacting many more lives in her region of these kids that want to get educated, want to know what God's plan is for their lives. And we just celebrate what God's done in Deborah's heart as she's come through the Hope Center program. God began a good work, right? And he's carried it to completion in her life, and he'll keep going with that. I want to introduce you to Marjorie on video now. Marjorie is the Hope Center director. She is a gospel partner for sure. She lived in the capital city of Lusaka and was part of Fairview Baptist Church, which has kind of become a sister church to us there. They support the work of the Hope Center, send people onto the missions teams that we send there, and we do those weeks of Go Team service together. And Marjorie has become the director of the care center because God called her to leave the city, be out in the rural area, and use her leadership skills at the Hope Center. She does a fabulous job, and she's just a really bubbly, joyful person. She was on our Tuesday prayer call this week, and I got to share a little bit there. But we want you to hear a little bit from her about what God's been doing during even the pandemic time and some of the challenges that's brought about this year.
Yeah, we've missed you guys, and this year has been a really, really rough year, I'm sure for you as much as it's been for us. And I'm just so thankful to all of you for continually being faithful, even in a time like this. You continue to support the work here at the Hope Center, and yeah, we've seen God's goodness even in the midst of COVID-19, although we couldn't spend as much time as we'd like to. And so we came up with the idea of providing food packs for the families. And so you didn't just feed that one child that comes to the center, but you were able to feed families. And we're talking probably almost close to 300 people that you were able to feed in the last 6 months. So thank you so much, Brookside. And we were able to see that the children were still healthy during this time. And even as they've now come back to the Hope Center, we've seen that those packs obviously went a long way to keep them in good health. So thank you so much.
Yes, you probably didn't realize, in just your normal giving to Brookside this summer, as we supported our missions work, we supported not only those kids, but their families as well during a really tough quarantine time in Zambia. So thank you for being a part of that. And I want to turn our attention now to the Dominican Republic. That's the other part of our global work. And our work there focuses around church planting alongside a guy named Miguel Shaw and his team. of people there. Miguel actually grew up here at Brookside, and when he was on a youth mission trip with Oasis, God really kind of rocked his world and woke him up to the needs that he saw around him in the DR, and God really called him at that time to give his life and share the gospel there in the DR, and he's done just that, and he's married and has kids now, but they live and consider themselves Dominican, and just really embrace the vision there, and they've built up a great local team of Dominicans who serve in that area and are learning how to plant churches, and they're really transforming the region around them. About 5 years ago, Miguel and his team introduced us as a church to Octavio. Octavio is a guy who does automotive repair to pay the bills at home, but his passion is to share with those around him about Jesus and to go out into specifically small towns outside the city where he lives and try and plant churches there. And so we got to become Octavio's main partner. Our mission trips, our Go Teams trips would go there and work in the town that Octavio was focusing on, the town of Guandules. And on those first trips, we'd actually walk the town with Pastor Octavio, and we'd just pray, and we'd try and meet people and just share with them why we were there and what was going on. And little by little, we made inroads in the community. It started off with a woman named Santa who offered her front yard for some space for the church to gather. So the first church gatherings were really in the front yard, and just you can sing in there, and you can see whether it was a VBS with a kids program or just an actual church service right there in that front yard space. And little by little, as the relationships grew, more people came to know the Lord there in that town. Pastor Octavio had a chance to really get a church leadership together that rallied around the vision to build a church building. And so a year ago, we actually went with a team and got to celebrate in this new church building. It's this beautiful blue building that just shines like a light in the community, a place where there was not a church before. And now this is a center, for hope in that area and for sharing the gospel there. And those people, as we celebrated the opening of their church, they were actually sharing with us about how they're going down the road further to another town that doesn't have a church and starting Bible studies there already. So they're multiplying churches. Love seeing what God's doing in this area. As we celebrated what God started there, the work he began, that he's brought to completion in Guandules, we also said, hey, what's next? And so we have now 2 new communities we're focused on and a new church planting partner. As Octavio has stayed with Guandules, we've headed on now to do some work with a guy named Arwam. And Arwam is a part of Miguel's team that he's trained up. And Arwam and Connie, his wife, and their team are visiting Buena Vista and Loma Mina, 2 new communities that don't have a church presence there. And we're excited to see what God's going to do there in these new communities. And I want you to meet Arwam, at least on video for a minute here, and hear his heart for the people he's sharing with recently.
Hello, Brookside Church. God bless you. We are here in Buena Vista. Today we were visiting Regito's house. He had surgery, and he's doing well. Thanks God. He's now staying at home, and now he's very receptive to the gospel. Please pray for him, and also pray for Graciosa's house and her family. We are sharing the gospel with them too, and with Milquella's house, Milquella's family. Please pray for all of them, pray for the community, and pray for us that we are sharing the gospel now openly with them, and they are being very receptive to the gospel. Thank you for your support, and God bless you.
Church planting is really just building relationships, right? And Arwam does a great job of getting in the community and meeting people like the folks he mentioned there, that we can be praying for them, right? And those relationships build up eventually a church that grows in the area. So we're excited to see what God's doing there. As Miguel's team has expanded around the region they're in, they started about 10 years ago. Now 25 different churches have been planted there, and they're looking around saying, this region is just about covered. These communities have churches, they're active, they're growing, and they're looking ahead to the next area. Further west of them, from where they live in the Dominican Republic, is closer to the Haitian border, the province that's right there. It's the most impoverished area of the country. And just these last couple months, Miguel actually approached our team and said, hey, would you be interested maybe in praying with us about what will we do in that new area, maybe establish a new ministry base in that new province west of where they are now, and we're going to see what God does there in terms of 100 new communities that they've identified that are in need of a church presence. So we're excited to see what God will do next in that area. So that's kind of a summary of what we got going on globally between Zambia and the DR. God's doing lots of neat things, really bringing a lot to fruition over the years, and there's much more to come, I'm sure. As we heard from Tim this morning about the importance of gospel partnerships, and then we see globally what God's doing, I just want to bring that home to us today too, right? And make sure we do something with that this week in our lives. So I want to just lead us in a prayer together of how do we apply this and what will God do among us here too. So God, we thank you for the truth of your gospel, how it changes lives. We thank you that it is not only our hope, but it's the hope of those around the world who choose to trust in you, Jesus. So we thank you for that. Pray that you would use these words that we've heard this morning, these stories we've heard, this inspiration we have of the work you've done, and you'd apply it to our lives this week. God, that we could make a difference in our homes, God, in our schools and our workplaces, and that you would show us what's next for us in terms of sharing your gospel in our community as well. And we trust you for that work in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen.